most Indigenous people walk with complex PTSD for a number of reasons. And I'm one of those people. And we often struggle with identity because our ancestors were asked to deny their identity. And having been in the medical system, I've been asked to leave a hospital and denied care while I was having a miscarriage.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. I am so excited that you are here today and joining me on this amazing conversation, understanding our history, taking a deeper dive into our Canadian history, unearthing and uncovering truths and facts. With me to take a deeper dive into our Canadian history today is Professor Jessica Vandenberghe. She is an industrial professor at the University of Alberta here in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. She is also the Assistant Dean of Engineering, Community and Culture. She is an Indigenous engineer, a consultant, a public speaker, and a STEM mentor. Her consultant firm, Guiding Star Consulting, works to serve Indigenous communities. She also serves on a number of boards in council and is a mother of two. Jessica is passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, along with truth and reconciliation. Jessica is also a podcaster and co-hosts the podcast called Unsettled, Truth and Conciliation. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to check out the podcast Unsettled, Truth and Conciliation. I found it most prolific, most profound, loaded with information. So, without much ado, let us go over to meet my guest, Professor Jessica Vandenberghe, to talk about uncovering our Canadian history, residential schools, truth, and reconciliation. I'm so honored and privileged to have Professor Jessica Vandenberghe here to share this valuable and absolutely vital information for us to come and learn. And want to go on and just welcome you here, Professor. So please feel free to open us with land acknowledgement.
For sure. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's always an honor and a privilege to be able to talk about truth and reconciliation with a variety of audiences. And so I'll open us with a land acknowledgement. It is also a great honor to be asked to acknowledge the land we stand on, and the peoples of this land as well. And for me, I'm joining from the traditional territory, Treaty 6, Métis Nation Zone Number 4 in Edmonton, Alberta. And anyone listening, of course, might be joining from a different treaty region or unceded land or a different Métis area or even a different part of the world. But it's important to acknowledge the oppressive history that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit have experienced here in Canada, but also that they've acted as stewards to the interconnected relationship we have with land itself. And land spirit or Mother Earth, she has been around since the beginning of time. And she has always nourished and healed and protected us and embraced us. And we need to acknowledge those who've acted as stewards to that relationship, and often Indigenous people have done that for many generations and many centuries. We know the land holds the history and the footsteps and hearts of those many generations, and so the land acknowledgement is intended not only to acknowledge Indigenous peoples, but again, our relationship with Mother Earth and land spirit, and those who have been stewards to that relationship. And so, from my heart and spirit to yours, I'm happy to open this podcast in a good way.
Thank you so much for opening us. So I want you to please go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself. I know that you're a fellow podcaster such as myself. You co-host Unsettled, Truth and Conciliation podcast. So please go ahead and tell us a bit more about you.
Yeah, you bet. I'm always happy to share. So I am born from Denetah First Nation parents, and this nation is in northern Alberta. But I'm what is called a 60 scoop survivor, and that means I was put into the foster adoption system. And so I was raised in a very inclusive German family. I didn't bounce around the foster adoption system too much. I know many of my fellow Indigenous people have often bounced around to a number of different foster and adoption homes. So I'm fortunate to have been raised in one home. I grew up in rural Alberta on a farm, so very down to earth kind of upbringing, working hard, working the fields. We had grain and cattle, and we grew everything in our garden. That type of upbringing. But I did find my way from the small town that was closest by where I graduated from off to university. And I've been fortunate to take engineering, where I obtained 2 engineering degrees from the University of Alberta. And that spark of curiosity and creativity has been in me my whole life. And so it led me to quite a varied engineering career. I've been fortunate to try a lot of different industries. I've tried the oil sands industry. I've tried regulatory and infrastructure, consultancy, and now I find myself in academia at the university, influencing future generations of engineering students and being able to really bring to light underrepresented demographics, embracing equity, diversity, inclusion conversations, as well as truth and reconciliation, all of which are so important for everyone to engage in.
Absolutely, 100%. And that's why we're having this conversation today. And like I said, I didn't know much about Truth and Reconciliation or residential school or 60 Scoop or any other thing that we're going to talk about Indigenous people until not too long ago. Okay. So this is why I think it's so important that we continue to bridge this gap by having these open conversations across cultures, across races, so that we know how we can be part of Truth and Reconciliation, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So can you share with us just broadly the history of settlers here in Canada and how residential schools came to be institutionalized here?
For sure. And it's important to really come face to face with the truth of what has happened in this country and how we came to be to where we're at. That's so important because there are things that still are in effect today that are centuries old, and it really needs to move towards a more modern look at things. So if you talk with many of the Indigenous nations, they'll tell you creation stories about North America that are often referred to North America as Turtle Island. And we know from DNA samples, we know from science, we know from tracing back history and genealogy that Indigenous peoples came to North America many, many generations ago over the bridge, making their way up through Asia and then over through Russia and over the bridge into Alaska into North America. And so Indigenous people have been on Turtle Island for centuries before European settlers came. And so European settlers came on boats from the eastern side of North America, really being driven by the need for resources in Europe, driven by some of the Christian churches there, driven by governments for land discovery and a fight for power. There's a lot of wars that happened, of course, in Europe and some of that struggle for power. But as settlers came over, first as Vikings and then Christopher Columbus and then the French and then the English and the Spanish, they all had a huge influence on North America. But unfortunately, they came with an attitude really granted by that we see in the doctrine of discovery. So the doctrine of discovery is from the 1400s, where the churches essentially were saying, go out and discover things, but look, if you come across anybody, take what is theirs and look to convert them to Christianity and look to civilize them. And so this undertone already of unequal rights was already at that point of the early explorers. And so this attitude towards the Indigenous people that were already here when they came face to face with settlers was already one of being savage, being nomads, being people who needed saving, people that were less than human. And they were very much treated like objects taken into slavery or taken as gifts for queens and kings, or in some cases, the history pointed towards the want to assimilate, or the want to eliminate even the races. And then we see that play out as Indigenous peoples' rights to land and rights to resources, rights to anything was slowly eliminated. And it was put into concrete legislation with the inception of the Indian Act. And so while the explorers were coming and the lands were being settled, there was getting to be more and more areas staked out, borders being drawn, wars being fought, the states being formed, Canada being formed. But in the meantime, there was an impression and attempt to make amends with Indigenous people and carve out a space for them. And those were where the treaties were starting to be signed. So from an Indigenous perspective, it was looking like we were finding a way to collaborate. But then once Canada became a country, and it was well staked out that it was a nation, a few years later, after Canada became a country, the Indian Act came into effect. And so that is a hugely oppressive piece of legislation, out of which came things like the reserve system, status Indians, residential schools came out of that. The chief and council system on reserves and governance systems, no gender rights, and so many other things that just were meant to assimilate and oppress Indigenous people. And that was just for the First Nations. The Métis have a more complicated history as well with Canada, as do the Inuit too. So that's kind of the origin of where residential schools came from, is originating from that Indian Act, which again is still in effect today.
Yeah, which is still in effect today. And maybe this is a time that I feel like we should talk about the Indian Act a little bit and how it continues to be repressive and non-supportive of Indigenous people. And if you can share a little bit about that. So we know that the Indian Act, was enacted in 1876. Is it implemented and enacted and instituted, executed the same way in essence, I guess, maybe in essence or maybe in principle, as it would have been way back then when it first came out?
No, there has been some changes to it. So we see things like the elimination of residential schools.
Mm-hmm.
So even though that was born of the Indian Act, the last residential school we know closed in 1996. As well as there have been efforts to kind of band-aid solution parts of the Indian Act, and one of which is the gender rights as well. So, a century ago when the Indian Act was first put into place, women were often stripped of their status and stripped of their rights for many things. So, for example, if I lived during that time, having gone to university would have stripped me of my rights.
Wow.
Having had children to a settler man would have stripped me of all my rights. And not only my rights, but the rights of all my
All your
future
children.
generations and the children and the children's children. And so much inequality, even the right to vote. Indigenous men didn't earn the right to vote until 1920, and Indigenous women didn't earn the right to vote until 1960. So just even
Wow.
little things like that were a long time before some of these things have been patched into try to fix it. But again, it's a little bit more complicated than simply eliminating it. There needs to be a phased policy approach to a different world towards Indigenous peoples and communities.
Okay, and so let's talk about some of the impacts now. So we know that residential school existed for over a century, so over 100 years, and that research shows that over 150,000 First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children attended residential school, and thousands of them did not come home. And of course, we don't know the exact numbers because we those of us who've been following the media, we know some of the unmarked graves that we've been discovering recently, sadly. So I want us to talk about, in your opinion, what you think are some of the impacts of residential school and some of the things that were enacted also out of the Indian Act that continues to be repressive today to Indigenous people.
Yeah, for sure. And just, I know a lot of documentation says the first residential school was in the 1800s, but in actuality, the first residential school was back in the 1500s. So
Wow.
they've been in existence for hundreds and hundreds of years, not just a century.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. But when it comes to what happened in those schools, again, the intent of the government, and there's a lot of documentation around quotes from Sir John A. Macdonald and his politicians in the leadership wanting to eliminate Indigenous people, wanting to kill the Indian and the child is one of the more famous quotes. And what people need to understand is what that means at a personal level. For me as an Indigenous person, to kill the Indian and the child, that means doing away with everything that makes me who I am, doing
Absolutely.
away with spiritual beliefs and how I believed and how I practice, denying my family, being subject to abuse of horrific types, and being punished for anything that would naturally come to you, right? Wanting to sit with your aunties and uncles, you couldn't because they were in another reserve and you needed the Indian agent permission to go from reserve to reserve. Wanting to fight to keep my children, for example, when they were physically taken by Indian agents to be put in these schools, then I would have been punished for that. And abuse at all levels at a child development time, right? So you can just imagine yourself and remember when you were a child and being subject to things like physical abuse and verbal abuse and beatings and denial of food and not being able to speak the language that you grew up in and being punished for wanting to visit your sister or care for your sister, or and then being sexually abused and locked away, and it just on and on and on. There's evidence of testing on residential school participants as well, especially during the world wars and things like that. So just the most horrific things to happen to a child with little remorse, and then to be separated and almost brainwashed. It's such a horrific piece of our history.
Yeah. I want to pause here and just say to our listeners that this conversation that we're having here today may be triggering. It's not our intention at all for this conversation to be triggering. It is my desire and my hope that this conversation sheds light and brings information to you about our Indigenous brothers and sisters and how we can be allies in supporting them. So I'm hoping that if you are triggered with this conversation, that you reach out to mental health support, and it will be linked in this video as well as the podcast, or you reach out to a family member, a friend. You can even reach out to myself or Professor Jessica as well, just to debrief on this conversation. We're more than happy to chat with you. But I just wanted to pause here and just say this conversation might be triggering. So please take care while you are listening and watching our video. So I want to shift gears here now and talk about the public apology, the first public apology that was made, I believe it was in 2008 by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And I'm wondering what you think since that time. So 2018 until today is a bit of a time that has passed, and what you think are some of the maybe far-reaching, widespread, effective actions that might have happened since that time, and what are the actions that you would like to see come out of that apology. And I think Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also did a recent one as well in his time now as the Prime Minister. What can be done to help us push even closer towards conciliation and reconciliation?
That's a really good question. And especially just to talk a little bit on the apology. And so you could find a video recording of the apology on YouTube, on the internet, if you search for it. And I want to encourage people to watch that, because is it truly a heartfelt apology?
Mhm.
You can see in the background people not even paying attention. I think at one point a fellow person behind the Prime Minister even yawned during his apology. It didn't to me feel very sincere. But I do know having talked to residential school survivors, that for some of them, this was a huge thing, for sure. So I don't want to undermine the gesture of it, but from having watched that video, it didn't feel sincere and authentic to me. And of course, when anybody apologizes, even on a personal level, what you really want to see is a change in behavior. And so has the country really changed in its behavior at a federal level? It's hard to say. There have been many promises, and let's take Justin Trudeau, for example, on his platform when he was voted in the first time. He said, well, yes, we're going to do all 94 calls to action. But if you look at the progress that has been made on that, it's been very little progress on it. So it's a lot of promises, but it's more complicated to implement some of these things, because again, it does need to be implemented on so many different levels. There's a place for everybody to contribute to the calls to action. And I also just want to mention that Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself was not paid for by the government. It was paid for by residential schools.
Thank you. I was actually going to bring that up, but yes, thank you for doing that.
Exactly. And it called for 94 calls to action. And there have been many other commissions as well. The Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls have a commission report with 231 calls to action. Again, for everybody to take part in this, because it's religious organizations that need to apologize as well. It's RCMP and enforcement. The legal system needs to be adjusted. There's bias built into a lot of our policy and legislation, even how funding runs to ensure fairness to it all. But the hard part for government is that we live in a democracy. So it needs a majority in favor of some of these changes. Indigenous people make up 5% of Canada's population. So if we all cry together, we're still only 5% of the population. This is where the biggest impact people can have with Truth and Reconciliation is amplifying voices and being a voice for those who aren't invited to the table. And so in order to make real change, we need a lot of Canada's population to cry with us and to make the noise and to say we need change and we want change. And we want you as a federal government to put a lot of resources to this and make actual change. But knowing that that takes away for a little bit of time from other things that the government has responsibility for.
Absolutely. And that leads nicely to what I want to talk about is how we can be allies, as a Black person, as a Black African person, and as other, maybe other people of color. How can we be allies? And I really would also want to quickly say here for our listeners to go check out Jessica and George's podcast that I mentioned earlier. So Unsettled, Truth and Conciliation. It will be linked here. There is so much information in there. In getting ready for my conversation with you, I thought I would need to do a whole bunch of more research, but I didn't find it necessary. Just the guests that you had, the quality of information, really easy to understand and digest, and really helped me in understanding the climate and what is our role and how we can do even like little things like having conversation with our kids. It's just so much that we can do. So I want to say that how can we then work in our capacity, in our community. And also, please keep in mind my community, so the Black community and the African community, on how we can be this ally that you just mentioned, how we can be the bridge. And also something that one of your guests said, I think is Lydia, the graduate student, is that she found that sometimes in being allies, you have to stand. Sometimes you're standing in front and sometimes you're standing beside, and sometimes you have to step back and stand behind. And I like, even saying it gives me goosebumps right now because it is so true. Because my mind went to the Black Lives Matter movement that continues to be ongoing, and how we have allies from, Asian community, white community, who you see predominantly in a lot of these rallies, because Black people don't feel comfortable in going to some of these rallies for very, very good reasons. So how can you maybe give us some actionable steps, some small bite-sized tips that you feel that we can take home today within my community and begin to implement so that we are better allies?
This is an excellent question. And I just want to acknowledge as well that newcomers to the country, people of minority genders, minority races, ethnic groups, of religion types and spiritual belief that's different than Christianity, do have a bit of a harder time in Canada as well. Like, even though Canada is welcoming, the special supports or the equitable supports in order to create an inclusive place are not always there. And so I just also want to acknowledge that your folks and your ancestors as well, that you have similar struggles to what we have too. And that is something that creates a bond and an empathy that is between our families and between our peoples. And that is so important to acknowledge, because when I talk about truth and reconciliation with a number of different audiences, the most empathetic are often newcomers or those of different racial backgrounds than the white settlers more in Canada here. And so when it comes to being a good ally, being someone who can support, I think it's important to realize that people can contribute in many ways. One of the simplest ways that I encourage people to do is simply bring humanity and value back to Indigenous people by simply looking at them in the eye. And this is something that, as someone who grew up in a place where it was never blatant racist action to the point of physical violence towards me or anything like that. It was a subtle exclusion. It was a subtle, being ignored, being invisible, being always pushed to the back of the crowd, and, feeling people's glances look at me, but then slide off of me fairly quickly, not being treated essentially as a human. And that is tough, right? And it emphasizes this idea that we don't have value or we don't belong. And so just looking Indigenous people in the eye, smiling at them in the street, just treating them like you would a relation, is a good first step. Exactly what you emphasized as well with what Lydia had shared around, yes, sometimes every Indigenous person is at a different state of healing as well, and a different state of knowledge for truth and reconciliation. I have done and am doing a lot of intentional healing for the trauma in my past, but also learning about the history of my peoples, because that is part of my healing journey. But not all Indigenous people know the history and know why there's so many socioeconomic issues and why there's intergenerational trauma, and how that plays out in relationships and poverty cycles, and how governance on reserves works differently, and it's set up to not have the community revenue needed in order to make strong infrastructure for its peoples and things like that. And so learning alongside Indigenous people, some people just need somebody to listen, someone to just walk with them quietly. Some people need somebody to amplify their voice. I know when things happen to me, when comments are made by other people towards me, my survival instinct goes to freeze. And so I can't defend myself in the moment. And hopefully one day I'll be able to, but I'm so grateful for the friends who are with me or the family that are with me that will speak up in the moment for me. So being that voice, again, for people who find themselves voiceless in the moment. But then also, again, standing behind, like you said, so amplifying voices, bringing to light the capability that exists within Indigenous people, and giving opportunities and always opening doors is a huge part of it too. So many different ways, just in simple terms, that people can get involved.
Absolutely. So just a quick recap to our listeners. There are simple things that we can do, starting with being a voice, looking and recognizing Indigenous people. I want to stop and focus on that one, Jessica, because this is going to sound horrible, but I really try to be very authentic and very real in my podcast. But when I came back to Canada, so I didn't get really good information about Indigenous people from anybody. Like, maybe random people I didn't know, people who would make all kinds of really derogatory statements that I don't need to repeat here. I think we all know some of those statements, or we know somebody who said something, or someone who something has been said to. And this is something that I felt like wasn't really talked about. These statements were just kind of made loosely, callously, but there was no fact checking, and there was no other institution to say the opposite. So I did go to grade 12 here. And when I was doing social studies and history, this is not something that came up, at least where I went to do upgrading school. It's not a conversation that was had. So maybe that would have been an opportunity to correct some of the biases and misinformation that I would have heard and learned over the years. It wasn't much until my adult life that I started to do my own research, start to make an effort, start to understand things that I started to see. Like, this is, this is just false, right? Like, you can't make these kinds of statements on nothing. And back to what you said about humanity, like, treat people the way you would like to be treated. I think that is so simple. And the suggestions and tips that you've given us on how to practice reconciliation is basically founded and grounded on that. And that's how I see it. Like, if you don't want to be treated, like a doormat, then don't go around treating other people like a doormat. Like, I mean, I think, it's pretty basic and pretty straightforward. And do your own research. If someone tells you that a group of people, take my own people, for example, and they say, I think the word they use sometimes is DIB or something like that. So driving while DWB, driving while black. Go do your own research, right? Go have a conversation with that community and get to know things for yourself. Another thing also is the misinformation also came with, oh, those people don't really want to be talked to. Then there are people that, oh, they want to approach Indigenous people, but they've been brainwashed and fed these lies and this misinformation that Indigenous people don't want to have these conversations. Or, like, no, they will be offended. You have to be really careful and sensitive. Obviously, we need to be sensitive in our communication, but that has nothing to do with getting out there and having this conversation and being the voice, like you said, and keeping this conversation going. So I wanted to point that out. And then I also wanted to say that when it comes to what you said earlier about Canada being, a welcoming, or said to be a welcoming country, and I think it was 1970 or 1971 where it was declared to be a multicultural nation. It's not necessarily welcoming, like you said, to certain groups of people. I think about the Black Muslim women who who continue to be attacked quite openly and broadly in our community, in our neighborhoods. I had a conversation with a Muslim woman about that. I think about the struggles of Black people here and elsewhere around in Canada. And I think about the healthcare system as well. So when your community goes to access the healthcare system, I think some of us should know, and maybe I can link some research in this conversation for people to go check out. Um, there are a lot of research out there that shows that the healthcare system does not favor Indigenous people. We know how Jordan's principle, and maybe I'll let you talk about that a little bit, how Jordan's principle came to be. And Cindy Blackstock is one who is like out there and talks about this a lot. And I learned about Jordan's principle through one of her seminars and some of her teachers. So I want you to just really quickly just shed light a bit more to how these inequalities remain in systems. And maybe it's education, maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's policy systems. You've already talked about legislation. And maybe it's just, like you said, simply just recognizing Indigenous people when you come across them, wherever on the street. Have you ever wondered, and maybe I'm talking to someone here today, I hope, have you ever asked yourself, why is it that when you see an Indigenous person, maybe on your way to, I don't know, Shoppers Drug Mart or Value Village or superstores, wherever, why is it that you're not making eye contact? Could it be something you've learned in the past? Could it be something you've heard about Indigenous people that I'm hoping that in our conversation today, you are unlearning and you are seeking to relearn? So can you please help us out a little bit more with some of that systemic racism, systemic discrimination that we don't even know we're doing. And this is a chance for us to correct them.
100%. There's so much data showing that there is oppressiveness within our systems. And you gave a good example of the healthcare system, Jordan's principle. That's where little Jordan River, he was born with disability. His mom went to the healthcare system and said, I need some help. I can't care for him on my own. I need some help. And so he was put into the healthcare system, but he wasn't given the care that he was needed. And his mom wasn't given the supports that she needed as well to care for him, because it came down to a jurisdictional battle between province and federal government. Who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for this? And while that jurisdictional battle was going on, Jordan River passed away. And so Jordan's principle is really around a child needs care. It doesn't matter who pays for it; it gets paid for, and we sort out who is going to be billed at the end after that. That child care, especially, is so important. We see the effect of oppressiveness in the education system, and I live in Alberta, and it's a good example. When the calls to action came out, our K-12 education system really took them seriously, and I was part of working with some of our school boards, and they had their circle of elders, and they worked to incorporate history and teachings into curriculum. But now we see with a change in government that the curriculum is going even back to a stage where a lot of that is erased out of it again. So progress was being made, but then we see influence of politics come in and change it to an even worse spot. In terms of the legal system, we see through things like murder and missing Indigenous women and girls. We see through cases like Tina Fontaine, who was a Winnipeg, I think she was a 15-year-old girl who was murdered, and her body was found in the river. And her murderer got off on charges, and then the Crown doesn't appeal. We see the same with Colton Bushy's case, and there's a great documentary called We Will Stand Up if you want to learn more about Colton Bushy's case, but he comes from the Red Pheasant Nation in Saskatchewan, where again, he was shot point blank in the head by a farmer, Gerald Stanley, and Gerald Stanley was found not guilty, with the Crown not appealing. And we see things like this happening in the legal system. And it's cases like this that you see that it's at a systematic level, that it's not only ingrained into policy and legislation and in things like the Indian Act, but then it's also ingrained into biased decisions and prejudice actions. And I know from personal experience as well, most Indigenous people walk with complex PTSD for a number of reasons. And I'm one of those people. And we often struggle with identity because our ancestors were asked to deny their identity. And so that it's complicated when it comes to that. But having been in the medical system, I've been asked to leave a hospital and denied care while I was having a miscarriage. And that to me was a racist action. And I went through the processes needed to look for justice for that, and to no avail. It didn't result in anything, but I have been actively trying to heal that. But what that doctor needs to understand is that results in decades and decades of healing for me to come to terms with that happening to me, and building trust again with the healthcare system that I can rely on it if I should go, and then worry for things. Worry for example, for my children, should they go to the healthcare system, are they going to get the care they need? So the systems and the actions of individuals within this system leads to unconscious bias, prejudice, racist actions, but also the systems are built to support those decisions of those people.
Thank you so much. I do also want to say that you mentioned We Will Stand Up. There is also a bunch of other resources that people can also go check out. And I'm thinking of Secret Pact by Tragically Hip. And there's that whole illustration that is on YouTube. I think that's a good one to show little ones as well. And there is another one that I'm really trying so hard to remember, and always starts with home, but I can't remember the other word. And that was actually done internally here in Alberta. And I will find it, and I will link it. I just remember the first word is home, and I can't remember the other, but I know I will find it. So can you share just really quickly some resources that we can use to have these conversations with little ones, with younger ones? Because like you said, as part of the calls to action from the Children Reconciliation Commission's report, these things started getting integrated into education. And like I said, when I went to school, this is not something I learned either in university or in high school. And it's awesome to see that younger kids are learning this now, because my little one comes home and she, she shared about Orange Shirt Day on September 30th. And every now and then she's coming home and sharing different things that she's learning about Indigenous people. In fact, when I told her that I was having a conversation with an Indigenous woman, she was really excited, and it was bedtime, but she really wanted to come and say hi. So it's nice for kids to be excited about this. And I think it's really important in order to shift mindsets, and also to keep these conversations going, and to keep the action going in terms of implementation. So I want you to maybe talk to parents and caregivers within the Black demographic, if you can share any resources or any information that you feel is a good spot for them to go to get information, so that they can start this conversation on their kitchen table.
For sure, definitely. There is actually quite a few Indigenous writers within this country. There's quite a few books and resources, like even just a simple Google search looking for kids' books geared towards truth and reconciliation. CBC always produces some really good lists of compilations around in June, in National Indigenous History Month, or around Indigenous Peoples Day, as well as on Orange Shirt Day as well, September 30th, National Truth and Reconciliation Day, that are great places to look for those. There's a lot of Indigenous teachings also found within those children's books as well. And there's also, for the teens and the high school demographic, a lot of graphic novels as well. Inside Circle is a great one. It is, again, a graphic novel that tells the story of Indigenous man and his struggles with addictions and finding his way through, and what that feels like and what that's like, struggling with some of the socioeconomic issues that surround a lot of Indigenous people. And so just having a quick Google search, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous authors and books geared towards kids. And I think it's so good when you can have these conversations with kids and learn with your children as well. Like you said, my kids come home as well. I'm a mother of two. They come home with things that they've learned in school, and we have some great conversations around what they have learned. And I tell them about the things that I have learned as well. And kids are very understanding, and they're very easy to talk to about these things, and they believe them. Sometimes it's easier to talk to children about the truth of what happened than it is to adults, especially adults who are really in that fear zone, where they're still very much locked in denial that there is even an issue. But children, for sure, they believe, and they know, and they can imagine what that feels like, and they can come up with ways to really be empathetic, but also ways, if you ask them, like, what do you think we can do for Indigenous people? They'll come up with some very creative ideas. And I think there's so much to be put into conversations with our kids about truth and reconciliation.
Absolutely. Speaking of creative ideas, I really like what I think it was your co-host George said in one of the episodes about the blanket exercise and doing it in Sunday school. So there's so much, like you said, these resources they can go Google. I know that Amazon Prime and Netflix has some also really good cartoon for little ones that you can check out there. And of course, there's always podcasts you can listen to, like tons of podcasts. There's I think it was Historical Canada. They have some mini series going on there about Indigenous peoples, and I think it's a great resource as well. So we're coming really close to the end of our conversation today. And Jessica, I want to thank you again for being here. I do want to I do want you to share. I know you've said this before, but as we're closing, I want you to share with us maybe 3 to 4 far-reaching, sweeping policy changes that you feel that can make better impact and can truly make reconciliation actionable, right? Can actually move it in a better way than it has been going since it got passed in 2015. And this is a chance where you can highlight maybe any other work that you feel like the government has started, and maybe they just need to move on a little bit better, and help us to see, to identify and recognize these things when they're actually happening, and we can hopefully hold our government, and our elected officials accountable for some of these actions when we see them.
Definitely. I think the first thing that the government really needs to do is ensure that they are also being the leaders of good policy making. And what I mean by that is a lot of pieces of legislation allow the government themselves to be exempt from it. And so, for example, the government, for a lot of their grants now, are encouraging GBA plus analysis and impact reporting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's gender-based analysis. But they should also take that lens to their policies and take that lens to what's existing and be the example of how you implement that. Because if they did that, equality and equity for Indigenous peoples would fall out of that. So holding themselves accountable to what they're expecting everyone else to be accountable for is a huge thing that the government should do. I think leaders should always role model how to be on the best behavior. They should always be the leaders in good examples of how to move forward. Other policy changes, I would say one of the biggest things is really thinking about the funding model and how money works and flows to reserves. There's 634 recognized First Nations in Canada, and there's many that aren't recognized that still exist. And they're given, you hear these announcements, oh, the government's putting, $1 million into infrastructure. But if we look at something like that, when it flows and the government takes all their administrative cuts as it flows through all their departments, it gets to the point to a grant program for nations to apply for, then only a few nations that are successful in the grant will get their infrastructure. When there's 600 plus nations not getting infrastructure and it's deteriorating. So just how the money flows needs to change, as well as the amount of money. The other thing as well, to speak up for the Métis and Inuit, the federal government does do a lot for First Nations, relatively a lot for First Nations, but the Métis are missing. So the Métis funding, they don't have the funding that they need. We're fortunate in Alberta to have the only land-based Métis settlements here in all of the world. But the governance and the infrastructure and the legislation to treat them as independent nations is not existing. And so that relationship needs to change. And I'm not as informed on the Inuit, but I'm sure there's inequity and inequality of how the relationship with the Inuit communities govern themselves and how funding comes to them as well. The other thing that really needs to happen is that government actually needs to go to the communities and actually see the state of affairs and understand it and really see firsthand what the impact of trauma does to whole communities. The biggest thing I always advocate for on a personal level is support for healing resources. So as I mentioned already earlier in this podcast, I have complex PTSD. And it costs a lot for me to go to therapy. My benefits usually cover maybe 1 or 2 visits, but ideally I should be going every couple of weeks. And so I do pay for a lot of that out of my own pocket, but it would be great if there was more funding available so I could make therapy part of my regular self-care, and that there was some cost sharing in terms of that. And it's one of those things where in terms of equity at an industry workplace level, understanding that Indigenous people are at various states of healing their trauma is important. Absolutely. because I still have to do my work even better and quicker than other people, because there's some underlining tones of stereotypes and capability, while still healing and raising my 2 kids. Like it is a lot. And some days it feels impossible, but you have to do it and you have to get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I do want to point out here too that if people are, for my Black demographic, if you're struggling with relating to some of the things that Jessica has said here, maybe do some research about Black settlers too here in Canada, especially here, even in Edmonton. There's some Black history in our city. So maybe also take a look at that history and then come back and take a look, listen to this podcast we've done, and hopefully that resonates with you even better. So any question at all that you would have liked me to ask that I didn't get a chance to? Anything at all?
No, there's a lot to cover when it comes to truth and reconciliation, and this is just a
Absolutely.
quick glimpse into the world. But again, I want to recognize that, just as you said, your history and your ancestors' journeys wasn't an easy one either, and isn't an easy one today. So I just want to acknowledge you folks as well. And so from my heart and spirit to yours, like I hope you are finding your way in this country, and that we can work together so that we all benefit and all get to a point of strong and healthy communities and people.
Absolutely. Let's keep building bridges, and let's keep being that ally that we need to be with one another. So thank you so much, Professor Jessica Vandenberghe. I hope I said your last name right.
You did, yeah.
I did? Okay. German names are not the easiest names, I'm just going to say. So thank you so much for being here today. Truly an honor, and just absolutely a huge blessing to have you on here, chat with me, and spend all this time to help us learn and be better enlightened about our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So I hope that this was a good conversation for you as well.
It was. And again, it's an honor to come and chat with you folks and continue these conversations with folks, because that's how we're going to make some change. So thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Okay, that's it. So stop in the recording.